everyone. To those of you listening, to those of you watching, I'm really excited to be here today. So, for those who have been following along for a while, we introduced you to a number of people with the Sexploration project last year, but we've added some new faces. And so today I have one of those new faces with me here to introduce himself. And I'm going to actually just give it to you to do an introduction to let people know who you are, and then reflect on or let us know a little bit about in this moment today or in general in life, what's making you feel good, Rahim?
All right. Well, my name is Rahim Thawer. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a social worker and psychotherapist. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I've been practicing for about 12, 13 years. I did my MSW at the University of Toronto, and I've since been focusing on sexual health, addiction, and the mental health of LGBTQ plus communities. Um, I'm really passionate about minority mental health, and I'm often describing my work and focus area as an examination of the intersection between systemic oppression and mental health. And that feels very important for me because I really like psychodynamic and psychoanalytic modalities. I also really like cognitive behavioral therapy. Both of those are highly critiqued for being individualistic and not political. And so for me, I think like you could do any kind of therapeutic modality poorly and devoid of politics. And I'm trying to imbue a sense of, being political, a real sense of what it's like to be in the world and bring that into my work. Um, and so aside from one-on-one therapy, I also provide clinical supervision, which is a kind of consultation support for other therapists. And I'm just about to launch some fun stuff. There's a Ballant group that I'm going to be doing with a peer of mine. Ballant groups are like these unique processing spaces for usually for physicians, but you could do it with any number of professions where they get to reflect on cases that take a step away from their day-to-day practice. And the intention is to help strengthen the relationship with the end user, usually a patient or a client. Um, the big thing I'm working on right now is a slew of books on queer guys and mental health, and I'm excited about that. I imagine I will tell you a bit about the content of those books as I answer the questions I think Ethan has for me in today's episode.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so excited about the work that you're doing because I have a very theoretical training in sort of like LGBTQ mental health and
Mhm.
trauma work. So sort of here's what I know exists in terms of inequities, and here's what I know people need in terms of services, but not the sort of practitioner clinician orientation. So I'm sure we're going to have, I hope, a very juicy conversation.
Another reason we would be a great match.
I appreciate that.
Just so the
So all
audience
right.
knows,
Yeah, right.
I'm using this interview time to kind of assess if Ethan and I should go on a date.
Well, I am available, so we can certainly see what happens, what transpires. So so this is in addition to introducing people to you.
Yeah.
This is going to appear in the first week of an 8-week What is Sex series, where we're really hoping to break down not just sex, but also relationships in general into some of its basic foundational components to really demystify things about relationships, intimacy, and sex
Mhm.
for people who, we do I think a lot of hyper sexualization in our society, but we don't often just like have the conversations that need to be
Mhm.
had and give people the relationship literacy and skills that they might need. And so this is a week that is all about like what are relationships in general.
Mhm.
So relationships 101, styles, types. With you, I'm interested in having a conversation specifically about healthy relationships.
Mm.
So, when you say like this relationship is healthy, or this is what a healthy relationship would look like, what are some of the first things that come to
Mm,
mind for you when I say that?
You know, in terms of just associations,
Yeah.
the first things that come up for me are like communication, mutuality, consideration, um, attentiveness, affection.
Mm,
However, let's take a step back because
yeah.
I think my free association with that, the language of relationships is it's not super meaningful on its own. And I think the language of healthy relationships is also challenging. My friend Marco Posadas, uh, he helped me really change how I think about this.
Mm,
And so he said, I don't think there's a healthy relationship. It's like all relationships, it's like part of your life. So there's, like you have a digestive system. You wouldn't say, is it a healthy one or is it not? It's
mm,
like, it's there, it's part of you. I think what you're asking is, when do you know that it's working for you, or when do you need to adjust things? When do you find something that creates an alignment in your body?
mhm,
And then when things don't feel aligned like it would in your digestion, how can you approach it to see what's salvageable or how it can be made better? And hopefully that doesn't sound too long-winded, but when I think about the state people are often in when they come for therapy,
mhm,
things are often not so great. The people will say, this person yells at me, or this person's manipulative, or this person, um, we're open, but one of our rules is not to have sex with our exes, and he went and had revenge sex with his ex. And
mm,
you're like, okay, to say, is this healthy or is this not healthy would be too reductive at this stage. If you were thinking, ideally, what do I want in a relationship? Sure. But at this stage, I'd be thinking more about um, when you hurt each other, what are you actually trying to communicate?
mhm,
When you hurt each other or you're the receiving end of hurt, um, how does that feel and what do you do with it? When you intentionally do something or you think that something you're going to do is not going to feel good for your partner, what need are you trying to get met? And what is it that you would need to communicate that feels hard? Um, so I know that doesn't answer your question,
no,
but go ahead. What are you thinking? Is
well, I
there?
mean, yeah, no, I mean, I think it does, in the sense that um a and this is a critique in the like theoretical conceptual area around the word health in and of itself, right? Which is like, what even is health? What does that even mean? I think health often has a moral connotation around it, right? That like healthy people are good people, and we like want to be healthy, and we're like striving for some version of
Mm,
perfection, which like when you're in relation with humans who are
yeah,
complex and complicated and come with trauma and etc.
all
it's
of those things.
it's really not, you can't be in pursuit of perfection, right? Like that's
Totally.
an empty goal, I think, in
Mm.
some ways. And I'm also thinking about this idea of like, I know, and I'm not going to repeat it, perfectly, but there's all these memes that are like, you can't have a healthy relationship until you're healed, right? Like until you've fixed yourself and your problems, right? Like no one will love you if you don't love yourself, like that sort of stuff, which I
Yes,
also think is ridiculous. Like,
I
right?
agree. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, did you want to finish? Did I?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I think there's some value to saying, like, if you lead with a sense of self-worth, you might attract somebody who respects that and honors that. Um, if you have had bad relationships in the past, or unhappy ones, and you've got kind of these core beliefs that it's better to be with somebody than to be alone, then you will find what you're looking for, right? You'll
Mhm.
just find the thing. And it might feel like a repetition, but then you'll ask yourself, how do I get into this situation all the time? So there is some value in thinking about who I am as a person and what do I want out of a relationship? What do I want that other person to add to my life? And then the specifics of like how long, like how often do we see each other? What kinds of things do we talk about? How do we engage? How much of each other's worlds get blended into our shared
Mm,
life together? And so those can be, those are harder questions, I think.
mhm,
Um, now I, you know, just as a catchphrase, you got to love yourself before you can love somebody else. You know, it's a bit reductive and it's a fun platitude.
mhm,
So you could write it on a mirror with your lipstick. That might feel nice for you, but it doesn't mean a whole lot, right? Because we learn to love ourselves in relation to other people. So when I hear people saying, "Oh, I'm focusing on myself," and that means not talking to other people or spending a lot of time at the gym, but with the exclusion of connection with other people, I'm like, I don't
mm,
know if that's focusing on yourself. To me, that sounds like you're avoiding other people and you're hoping the time away is going to allow you to transform it into something else that will then attract new kinds of people. Like it may or may not, you know, because
mhm,
I think we learn to like ourselves when other people like us, right? If somebody
mhm,
says to me, Rahim, I really like how you said this thing, or, you know, when you hugged me, I really felt it, or I appreciate you in this space. Those things are incredibly meaningful. Those things help me love myself and help me realize my value.
mhm,
I could build up a sense of value on my own through achievement, and that's also valuable. But achievement on its own, I don't think can be translated into the kind of self worth we are thinking about and talking about in the context of relationships. It's a bit different.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, affirmation and even reassurance. I think that reassurance gets a bad rap too in the mental health field, because it'll be like, oh, are you seeking like reassurance for a thing you should heal yourself? And it's like sometimes reassurance is really needed and beautiful. Like
And
it
it is
feels
the
good.
healing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes. There are these buzzwords, obviously that abound in internet spaces that I'm wondering how do you feel and is it useful for folks to be thinking about things like attachment styles
Mhm.
and trauma bonds and I mean because people are really using this language and like outside of therapeutic contexts,
Yeah.
which I think can get kind of tricky sometimes. But I'm wondering what you're feeling about knowledge of those things and like uptake of those things in terms of just everyday people thinking about being in relation.
So I do think that knowing your like knowing about your attachment style can be helpful, but I think it's most helpful if you take it as a piece of information in a larger puzzle, right? Because our attachment styles are largely determined by our early childhood relationships, in particular with caregivers or other significant people. So it could also be an older sibling, it could be, you know, an important teacher, it could be an extended family member, um, who the primary caregiver or caregivers are might also depend on your culture. You know, like sometimes people
Mm-hmm.
have a parent and a grandparent and a domestic helper, and they're
Mm-hmm.
all primary caregivers, right? So thinking like, okay, who were the different people in my life that I was relying on, and how were they there for me, and maybe not there for me in a time of need, and what was the impact? So I think we need a nuanced look at it. So it's not just like about just mom, or
Mm-hmm.
we want to make sure it's not just like um nuclear normative in the way we talk
Mm-hmm.
about it, because families tend to be more complex. And once we have this piece of information, I think we need to think about how does my attachment style change over the lifespan, right? So if I'm working toward being more secure, how do I honor the parts of me that are tend to be anxious in relation to others or tend to be avoidant in relation to others? And also, we should recognize that those parts of us usually don't show up right in the beginning of a relationship. In the beginning, we're courting. We are wanting to impress one another. We are incredibly like seductive, you know? Um,
Some
like
of us.
right, right. There's a I am. That's my first like
Mm,
few months in a relationship is like that.
mm,
But then the parts of me that are avoidant will show up a little bit later on when we have our first conflict, when we disagree on something, when, you know, we find that maybe our values don't align on something, or we
mhm,
have some difficult conversations around money. Um,
mhm,
and it's in those difficult moments that I think some of our attachment styles show up. And that's when we need to think about, how is what I'm doing serving me now, if at all? How did it serve me in the past? And what could I change in order for my partner to hear me better? Right.
mhm,
So, whatever we do, however we are in the world, is like perfect as is, because we have just a toolbox of adaptations to help us survive. But now we're considering another person, and we need to have a conversation about, hey, here's the thing I tend to do. How did you feel when I did that thing? And the other
mhm,
person will tell you, well, I said I needed space and you kept asking me this, that, and the other. Or the other person will say, I needed reassurance around this, and you said you wanted to go hang out with your friends. That, like, those things feel bad. And so to be able to talk about how we can adjust what our tendencies are so that it's not fixed in stone and that we're working with the person we're in a relationship with. That's attachment style. Uh, Trauma bonding is a whole other, I think, experience. Usually, trauma bonding is about connecting with somebody with whom um, you have gone beyond your own emotional threshold with. So there's this theory called the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is about when you are able to, when you're within a frame of mind where you can make the best decisions for yourself, and you're in an optimal headspace to respond to others. So if you feel triggered, activated, depleted, overwhelmed, something happens to your nervous system where you're in like hypoarousal or hyperarousal, right? And so if you're in either of those states and you're in that state with somebody else, you're vulnerable to trauma bonding. So a quick example of this is, you know, I can't leave my partner because uh, we came to Toronto when we had $2 in our pocket and we got each other through it. Or my partner was there when I seroconverted and was dealing with HIV and didn't know how to get services and I was new to the country. Or, uh, you know, I owe my parents something because, you know, all our lives we've had this shared story about extreme poverty and this idea that we'd get through it together. In a workplace where there's lots of change happening, people maybe feel slighted or maybe disenfranchised. They might start like building a relationship based on trashing the management, right? So these are different kinds of ways that people might trauma bond. Now, it can be useful. People like to be around other people with a shared experience, but it also traps you. It takes away your
mhm,
ability to think independently. And it can be dangerous if you feel like you owe somebody something to your own detriment, or if you fall into a kind of group think where your ability to think on your own is it's just not seen as valuable anymore. That was a
mhm,
bit long-winded, but hopefully that helped.
mhm.
You said two big
Yeah.
things.
I did say two big things. I mean, it's on my mind a lot because I think it's being talked about more and more, but certainly when I see trauma bond being used, it's usually in the wrong ways. So it's good to have a clarification, I think, for
How are
people who are
people
watching
using
and
it?
listening. Well, I think that people are throwing it around in kind of a similar way that, like, oh, he's a narcissist, or he, like diagnosis labels get thrown
Mm.
around or used out of context to sort of be like, well, maybe some of those behaviors are indicative of certain patterns of manipulation or etc. But where I'm not
Oh,
sure he's a narcissist or, so like there's a lot of, is this a trauma bond? Is that a trauma bond? Am I trauma bonded right now? Kind of conversations
okay. I
happening.
mean, I haven't heard. So, okay, I'm glad I'm hearing this because I don't think I've been seeing as much of it. I mean, I guess it could be useful to like to identify for yourself. But then, if you think like, what's the next step? The next step is to
Right.
say, let's build a relationship outside of our shared difficulty or our shared trauma. Let's connect around activities, personality, new projects, or what we want our lives to be together. Let's travel together. Let's do something else.
Yeah.
So it's not just defined by this one thing. And let's try to challenge the idea that like it would be a huge betrayal if we just merely disagreed with each other, because that's not going to be nice for either of us.
Yeah. But I think this is like in terms of, I don't want to use this language. Maybe we'll think of an alternative word before we're done today. But
Okay.
in terms of like healthy relationships or
Yeah, yeah.
adjusted or supportive,
Yes.
generative, whatever we want to say, I think that's where the point you made earlier about, do you know what your needs are? And
Mm,
are you able to communicate them, are very important. But so is, on the other hand, right? Like, is the other person going to hear you
mm.
and respond well
Yeah.
to that? Because I think that's where it's sort of like your own self-awareness, emotional IQ, whatever, can be here, but you also have to be in relation to another human that's willing to say, okay, I can drop my defenses for a second to hear what you're actually saying so that
Mm.
we can actually work together on this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yes, I totally hear that. I think um the skills and the literacy around this is really challenging. And so I always take this example of like being in supervision meetings with my director when I was working at a public health center. And she would always say, like, Rahim, how can I support you? What do you need from me? And I would get a bit annoyed because I'm like, it's a great question, but like, I don't know how to answer you. I just need to leave this meeting and obviously go work, get the things done because I'm behind, right? Like, I don't know what to tell you. And so in the same way, if somebody were to say, what do you want from a relationship? What are you looking for? What feels good? Like those things are hard
Mm,
to articulate. And when we have an idea about it, um, I think sometimes shame gets in the way because we're not
mm,
talking about merely receiving support in a work context. We're maybe also talking about like sexual interest, needs, curiosities. We're maybe also talking about like relationship models. We're worried about
mm.
saying things too fast or not fast enough. Um,
Yeah.
we're thinking there's a lot of mental gymnastics that go on about how we present ourselves because I think we've got this idea, which might not be untrue, but that there's like compatibility is going to be a piece of the pie, and then another piece of the pie is um like circumstance, like how
Mhm.
far do you live from me and how easy is it for me to get to you? And then, another part of it is also like, how do we play the game? How do we do the dance? And if I'm too much, will that be not good for
Mhm.
you? If I'm not enough, will you think I don't care? Blah, blah, blah. And so
Mhm.
people forever are trying to figure out what that pretense is.
Yeah.
And that's tricky stuff.
Yes. Yes, and I think it's particularly tricky. I mean, as you've already mentioned, some of these identities potentially are simmering in here, but it's particularly tricky for those of us who have other salient identities, interests, etc. So, I'm thinking about myself as a neurodivergent person. It's like, when and how and where do I divulge that identity if it hasn't been apparent at the beginning, or because of stereotypes? You wouldn't assume I am in particular ways. To what extent do I share how that impacts? Like, for instance, I have trouble with feelings, feeling them and expressing them, like naming them. It often
Ah,
feels physical. So I'll feel things in my body, and that's how I know I'm having feelings before I know
mm,
I'm having feelings. But that can make it tricky when being in
of
relation to
course.
other people, or kinky folks, right? So, like, when is too soon? I remember this is happening with one of my partners. We had just started really just like flirtatiously engaging with one another, mostly in a text based manner. and the question of like, well, what are you into comes up, and they write like 20 things, and then jokingly very quickly we're like, I didn't mean to present it like it was a menu, or whatever. I think
The
because they
menu's
were,
nice.
well, it is, but I think they were nervous, right? That, oh, actually, I hadn't tested the waters enough to know whether or not you would be cool with me presenting this information in this way. And so, I mean, I think this happens for a lot of us, but whether we want to say these are folks who occupy the margins, even though they're, often like we're global majority folks. But like
Yes, yes.
socially speaking, right? Occupying some version of an identity or life experience that has been subjugated or shamed,
Mm,
can make it really difficult.
yes.
Yeah.
You got me thinking about something when you said communication. And sorry, you like when you talked about feeling it and then maybe being able to say it, like the way it gets processed for you. And it reminded me of this overemphasis on communication,
Mm,
because that's not going to look the same for everybody. And I think about older communities of gay men who for whom I just finished facilitating a group, and they said, like we would meet people in person and we would figure things out as we go along. And they didn't say it always worked out great, but uh there was like we would figure it out. Like, is somebody gonna top, bottom? Are we gonna have oral sex? Are we gonna give each other hand jobs? And it was like it was fine. It was and in that it was fluid and you
mm,
figured it out in the moment. And so there's a kind of high context culture there where it's communicated without necessarily being explicit, which is
mhm,
true of other cultures in general. But North American Western culture, in our kind of age range, like millennials and younger,
mhm,
there's such an emphasis on having everything explicitly communicated. And while I like that, I don't think everybody needs to adhere to that. It's just not
mhm,
possible. I've met a number of people who said like they're monogamish, and
mhm,
there's just all this like being ethical, blah blah blah. Like, it's ethical for some people to say my partner does a thing once in a while, I don't want to know about it. It's fine.
mhm,
So people
mhm,
figure out what that means and looks like for them. And yeah, I think there needs to be this caveat. The communication is a skill in general in life, but then relationship and sexual communication is its own skill. It makes you say and think kind of crazy things that you wouldn't say to any other person. And then there's also like, are we in this high context space where less is said and communicated subtly, or are we in a more low context space where things are more explicit? Because a communication level has to be relative to the people in the relationship,
mhm,
right? Otherwise, it's overwhelming or not going anywhere, and that can be really tricky. Um, I remember once just kind of saying to my analyst, I wish somebody told me that communication doesn't solve everything. And he said,
mhm,
no, no, communication just ensures that it's there on the table.
mhm,
Then, of course, your partner's going to be mad, or now you have to resolve something, or now you're thinking about loss. You have to think
mhm,
about, will this get repaired? Maybe, maybe not. So
mhm.
communication doesn't solve anything. It just ensures that it's on the table.
Yes. Yes. And I think, while transparency and openness are super important, I think, I mean, that's me. And so maybe not to everyone's relationships, but to me, I do think that openness and, willingness to be clear and, I wouldn't want to be in relation to someone who intentionally lied to me about things, for sure. I
Right.
also, I also
I'm
think that there's
taking
something to,
notes.
I also think there's something to be said for this, like, idea that people can't have secrets. like in their head, like they can't have their own
Ah,
internal world, you know, that
yeah.
like everything I've ever thought about anything must be explicitly unearthed within my partner and me to my partner, so that there's no secrets, you know, as if we can't have our own internal thoughts, feelings, experiences that we just keep to ourselves either for a while or forever, you know?
You know, it reminds me of like a few therapy clients I've had who were survivors of sexual abuse,
Mm,
and their partners knew that something had happened in childhood. Um, and they had told me about the specifics because it was relevant to the work. And we processed it together. And then we also talked about whether or not they'd want to tell their partners. In two different situations, two people across, like, who show up very differently in the world said, you know what? I feel good that we processed it in therapy, but I don't want my partner to know the specifics. It feels it's too much. And we're like,
mhm,
yeah. But I think because we've processed it, you've been able to discern that this is something you want to keep private rather than it's a secret. You
mhm,
know, the
mhm.
secret sometimes feels like you're hiding something
Hiding.
that, and if
Mhm,
you were to share it, there'd be a consequence, but you've decided
mhm.
it's just it's going to remain in the realm of private. You don't
Yeah.
necessarily want to hear what somebody else thinks, and even though you have a sense that your partner will be very supportive, why set them up to be in a position to say the wrong thing?
Yes. Yes. I've known a couple of people for whom that's true relative to sex work, histories of sex work, where it's like,
Mm,
actually, I just don't think my partner needs to know that I did that thing.
right.
And it's like, yeah, I mean, fine, you know, like you should like, but I do think that there's a thread. I don't know that it's normative, but in the realm of millennials and younger and communication, and I mean even things around consent. I'm like, you know, we're living in a moment where it's like, no, it has to be completely verbal and enthusiastic. And it's like, I mean, I want to say that out loud as a starting place, and then I want to trouble that, because that's not actually what consent often looks like, and it can still be consensual if a person is maybe like not that enthusiastic in that moment, or in ways that
Yes.
it's nonverbal. And then of course it gets even trickier with like consensual non-consent and all of those things, you know, gasp.
Yes. Well, I think when we think about relationship, sex, pleasure, literacy,
Mhm.
practicing saying different things like that I am okay with this or that I don't want this, like that is a skill that could be practiced, like in a workshop, in a safe space with a partner, with, perhaps friends. Um, and then how you want to use it when is like a different thing, right?
Yes.
And it's not like you can use those skills in a way that's like a hard binding contract, or you could use it in a way that's a bit more uh, like it's intuitive, like we'll just see along the way, like, do you want to do that? Does this feel good? Can I do
Hmm.
that? And you can just say
Hmm.
yes or no, you know?
Hmm.
um yeah.
Yeah. I love to think of consent as just sort of like an ongoing conversation slash negotiation, you know? It's not really like, can we do this thing? And if you say yes to this thing, then it's only that thing, you know? It's like,
Right.
no, 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 no. Let's just see what we do and don't like. But you know,
Hmm.
with special attention to the fact that some people feel really unable to revoke consent or change their minds as well. So I do think it's important that in that way, you know, your potential partners, if that's something that's relevant in their lives, right? Happened to you. Um, but I do think you make a good point relative to like, you know, what we do and don't learn about how to be in relation from a very young age.
Mm.
And sure, I mean, there's a whole toxic cis masculinity thing
Mhm.
that we know gets deeply ingrained into little boys and people that we believe are little boys, about not feeling your feelings and not really paying attention to or needing to respect other people's. And I do think that that's why, on average, I mean, I don't want to be stereotypical, right? But like on average, women are more likely to read nonverbal communication, read body language
Yeah,
on people,
yeah, 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 of
and
course.
to be more sensitive to that, right? To say like, oh,
Mm.
that person's upset, or that person's angry, or that person's sad, or whatever. Um, and I think that like we should, like, speaking to this issue of being in relation in healthy ways, like these are conversations that start long before we're thinking about sex and intimacy. Like these are
Absolutely.
conversations that start with toddlers or younger,
Mm.
about like sharing toys or not hitting people, or like whatever the case is, right? Is to
Yes.
like be attuned to the
Hmm.
whole of a person.
Yes.
Um, because, I do think, I know you said, which I mean, it's fine for you to obviously feel this way and have this thought in your head. And maybe it's true for you. I know you said it, I played a part in this thing. From my vantage point, I just don't think that that's true. Because as you well know, like, right,
Yeah,
like imbibing is not playing a role in the thing. Like it's not like putting yourself in the physical space while under the influence is not in and of itself being party to this thing that happened. You know what I mean? Because
totally,
I
totally.
I because you wouldn't have done that to someone.
No, I
I'm
totally
I'm
agree
I'm
with
guessing, right? Like I think you would have been able to feel the energy in a particular way,
you.
even
Yeah.
while intoxicated. And so, I just do also want to say, like, I think
Mm,
yeah, sure, you were there,
mm,
but I think in another context, in another with another person, like it wouldn't have been that way.
right, right. Yeah, fair. I appreciate that. Needless to say, conversations about consent and the nuances of people, settings, nonverbal cues, all necessary.
Yes.
But also leads me to think about um, sex in our communities. You had mentioned that uh, like a lot of our communities can be highly sexualized. Um, and I don't know what it's like in the broader queer community. I would say like in cis gay men's culture, that is absolutely true. Um, and part of it is really fabulous and makes me think about how we bring innovation to relationships, and there are ways that we connect. We have sex and then we make friends
Yes.
afterwards, so that's kind of lovely. um However, I think both casual sex and long-term relationships, the pursuit of either of these things, come with rewards and challenges.
Mm.
And in fact, one of the books I'm working on is called Seeking through Thornapple Press. And I am doing a series of stories that explore, I want each story to explore one particular reward or challenge um, that a gay man can experience pursuing casual sex or long-term relationships or both.
Mm.
And the reason I want to do it that way, because I've got these charts, but I'm taking the charts and turning them into stories, is because I think we grow up in a dominant culture, which is mostly like a cis heterosexual culture that tells us how to be, usually informed by some kind of religious
Mhm.
doctrine. Even if people aren't
Mhm.
religious, they still
Mhm.
got rules that they think about. And then we come out and we've got subcultural norms. And so we've got these mixed messages or mixed what I call cultural scripts. And we're negotiating them, but we're figuring out what they look like for each of us. And so I'm interested in that complexity. And for me, when I think about queer guys or gay men, people who participate in cis gay men's culture, which can be a range of queer guys, that a lot of our mental health and how we feel it, like our mental health is in response to how we engage with the landscape of connection seeking.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say mental health, I define it as like how I feel about myself, how I see the future, how I see other people. It's about my beliefs. It's about accessing optimism. Um, it's like being connected to my emotions, being able to use those to guide me. That is mental
Mm-hmm.
health. And seeing how those are connected to this landscape of connection seeking. Somebody could be like, say, oh, I'm a cis gay man and this sexualized culture really isn't working for me. I'm not making connections. I feel really, really lonely. The sex is never that good, and I've had people with that experience years later say, you know what, I think I'm demisexual. Great. Now I'm trying a new thing, and they're finding much more satisfaction in what they're looking for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even in the subculture, there's a dominance, there's a like a hegemonic
Mm-hmm.
idea about how to be and how to
Mm-hmm.
participate. And that message for a lot of people says that casual sex is your way to participate in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking forward to this book where I have stories that just like really explore what it looks like to seek connection and what's good about it and what's hard about it.
Yeah. I mean, this is reminding me about the question that you posed before we started recording about like, oh,
Oh.
but is the Y cruisy or whatever? Because I do. So I mean, pretty much, I wouldn't say exclusively, but 99% of the time, the only time I'm actually on Grinder or have it open is when I'm at the gym, and I do it specifically to see who might do a little fire tap on me, because as a version of affirmation,
Yeah.
it's sort of like I feel so, I cannot even describe to you like how nervous I would be to actually do anything else with that information. You know what I
Okay.
mean? I don't very often look at my messages. I don't really respond to any yet. I'm not saying I never will. There's just something about feeling like I didn't ever learn like I knew of those norms,
Mm,
but I'm not, it's not like it's 15, 16, 20, 25 or whatever, I didn't have any introduction to that in any way. So I know it exists, but I've never participated even from a distance in that way. Like
see.
all of my experiences actually exist within the realm of being perceived as a woman.
Mm,
And they're just very different. Um,
yeah.
just very different experiences. So yeah, I love to see who taps me at the gym and who might be interested or whatever. But it is like, what am I seeking, and how am I seeking it? Like that's like I'm in process. It's a journey and I'm right in the middle of it.
Great. Maybe we'll bring my book, Call Seeking, to your university and we'll do a panel discussion
Yeah,
about what it
we
all
should.
means.
We should.
We'll
We
just
should.
unravel it all. We'll get to the bottom
Yeah,
of it.
we should. Yes.
Um,
Um,
Go
can
ahead.
I transition into it starts as a harder question, but
No problem.
hopefully doesn't stay heavy. But we're living in times.
Yeah.
Uh, we're living in times. Most of us are witnessing a lot of violence and trauma and death all of the time. It's like 24-hour news cycle, easily accessible. There's an aspect of that is deeply, deeply personal for so many of us for lots of
Mm,
reasons. But even when it's not deeply on an identity basis, personal, or on like actual connection to the thing personal, it's still hard and difficult to know that these things exist in the world and to witness them all of the time. I'm wondering about your thoughts on navigating this world, a world that is hell-bent sometimes on our destruction or our literal annihilation, and still seeking love, connection,
mhm.
care in particular ways. Like, I don't know if this is a question about how we remind ourselves that we're worthy of such things, or if it's just like, how do we both grieve and experience joy and pleasure at the same time, or if it's like both of those questions. But anything that it's making you think, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think the pursuit of connection and love um, has endured history, for a long time. Whether, not necessarily marriage, not necessarily 2.5 kids, and like not the
Mm-hmm.
relationship escalator, not necessarily, but I think the desire for companionship, partnership, even a domestic partnership, um, they're like nice ideas. I also see people living in big cities happy being single. And in a way, the city supports their singleness.
Mm-hmm.
You get to be more anonymous, you live closer to friends, you can carve out a life
Mm-hmm.
for yourself that's meaningful without feeling like it's deficient in some way. Um, if you're single, you're probably surrounding yourself with some people, right? And if you're a relationship person, then you're dating slash in a relationship. And I think part of that is, you know, thinking about who do we need in our lives that make us better, that challenge us in important ways, and who are we with, like, who support our values, you know? Um, I have a friend in New York, a Black gay man, and uh he always says, he's like, I don't fuck white people. And I'm like, great. um and I think that's like an effort to, toward decolonizing love
Mm-hmm.
in a way.
Mm-hmm.
um I'm not quite there, but I will say, like, value alignment's really important for me in meeting people. And you know if I went on a date now, if somebody was Zionist or pro, like, really
Mm-hmm.
supported the state, I don't think we'd be a match. And I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't want to have a conversation with them. I don't want to change
Mm-hmm.
somebody's mind, especially if it's a date, because we don't have anything invested in each other at that point. Um, I do recognize that everyone's going to have a different sticking point, like, um, for me, it might be about ending Israeli apartheid. Somebody else might say, like, they can only date vegans. Or somebody else is
Right.
going to say, I can only, um, I need to be with somebody who really understands, like, the genocide in Sudan, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think and I don't think it's about knowing everything all of the time, but I think it's a shared sense of value and a willingness to learn so that
Mm-hmm.
people can be there for each other. Because I think that's a lot of what they want out of a relationship. Um, I think in the current climate, I know for me, I've experienced an increase in isolation in some ways because I've been hesitant to date as much. And then there's also we also grieve when we're not directly being impacted by something. And so sometimes that grieving happens alone, because if you try to
Mm-hmm.
do it with people, they may or may not get what you're talking about. Or it's just like if a family member died and you're with people who say strange
Mm-hmm.
things that don't they're helpful, but they miss the mark. You're like, I think I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna grieve. I'm just gonna do this alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
So I think those are some of the things I think about. I consider. I would say, you know, there's been a lot of wars in the world since World War II. Like, in terms of scales of wars,
Yes.
we're kind of lucky we haven't had as many. So we can, like, make weekend plans and they'll happen.
Yes.
Like from a historical perspective, that's like kind of new. And I don't know if that is temporary and we're moving into another era where things become less predictable. But of course, it's going to look different. If that's true, it's going to look different now than it would have in the past,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because with technology and hoarding of wealth and late stage
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, some people will be okay and
Mm-hmm.
many, many, many others will not. So
Yes.
I'm as
But
lost
that,
as you, my friend.
yeah, I mean, yeah, for me, sometimes the grief itself is some version of knowing that I am only able to access these joys and pleasures because of my privilege, you know?
Mm,
And it's like
yeah.
there's like guilt in feeling good knowing that so many other people aren't actively but also can't in some various ways. And I don't want to say can't because as we know,
But yeah.
there is also plenty of, you know, moments of connection and love and solidarity and joy. um but again, it can feel like, how dare I make plans this weekend, you know?
Yeah. And I think we
um
do grieve inequality. I think we do grieve privilege. Like it's so, it's hard. It's hard. And then when our grief immobilizes us around those two particular things, the people around us often won't get it because
yeah.
they'll be like, hey, you're self-sabotaging. And you're like, no, I need a moment
Yeah.
to catch up with how
Yes.
complicated the world is.
Yes. Yes. I mean, so what is your, if you had advice, like if you had someone who was sharing these things with you, what would be your advice for helping them to recenter the idea that they are deserving of experiencing joy or pleasure or moments of happiness, these sort of glimmers? Like, how can they get back in tune with themselves? Get out of
You,
that intellectualized space and get back maybe into the body, as one way of saying it, or
you
otherwise.
love the word glimmer.
Do I?
You love glimmers.
Well,
Can
I,
you explain to the audience what a glimmer is first?
sure. A glimmer in succinct, perhaps most easily understood ways, a glimmer is maybe the opposite of a trigger. So, a trigger is a thing that reminds you of or takes you back to or brings up a feeling in your body that is negative or not so great, usually related to trauma of some sort. And a glimmer are the things that make your body feel positive things. Maybe there's a euphoria, or I mean, it can be anything from like watching the sunset can be someone's glimmer, or a song that you really love, or seeing the face of someone you really love, or just the memory of something
Yeah.
beautiful that happened. But yeah, it's something that makes you look forward to the future, or makes you feel good in your body.
Great. So to piggyback off of that, I think the conversation with the person would be when you're with other people, whether it's a friend, a family member, or somebody you're dating, it's normal to have a bit of anxiety, but the key is going to be discernment. So let's try to figure out where the anxiety is coming from and what is it telling you?
Mm.
Is the anxiety telling you that this person isn't safe or you can't share certain things with this person? Is there a desire to say something that could then make you closer to the person potentially? So it feels like a big social risk. And how are you evaluating social risk? Um, or is the anxiety about not wanting to say something to upset the person because you
Mm.
want them to like you because maybe they're conventionally attractive and you're worried you're going to say something that's too heavy. So I would say let's go from anxiety, the overarching thing, to a bit of discernment and like what could the anxiety be about? Because a bit of anxiety, very, very helpful, right? You're like
Mm.
humble, puts you in touch with your humility. That anxiety is going to help you remember this moment better than if you were euphoric. Um, and the anxiety might also help you attune a bit better to the other person. So it could be a great way to forge a nice connection. However, if it's holding you back, I'm curious about, the thoughts that are connected to it. And there's parts of you that are speaking to you. And what are they telling you? Right?
Mm.
Because it's going to be different when it's your family of origin versus somebody you're dating, or somebody you've met online. for a lot of folks, I'm worried that they are going to have an idea about me that's different than who I actually am.
Mm.
Great. Then we have something to work with, right? Um, yeah.
Well, I think my last specific question for you is just
Mm,
about resources. So we do like with these chats to compile a list of things that were mentioned in the dialogue, but also things that might be helpful to folks. But if someone was genuinely interested in starting to shift how they relate to others, to seek out better connections with folks, whether that's healing things that need to be healed or just, generally like, I know actually I know what I need and want, and I want to be able to communicate that to someone else, or I want to be able to center that in my life. Are
yeah.
there books, um, social media accounts, like places where you would say, what, go here maybe to start. This would be a good thing to read, or this would be a good thing to reference in your
Yeah.
pursuit.
Yeah. So there's accounts and there's also books by the same person. One's called An Anxious Heart's Guide to Non-Monogamy. And then I would suggest the book Attached. It's a very popular book by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. If you look on YouTube, there is a group called the School of Life, and they do a great video that's called What is Your Attachment Style? Now, I don't
Mm,
love all of their language because they refer to people as being damaged, which is not
mm,
nice.
mm,
But
mm,
overall, it is like a pretty good video, I would say. Um, there are a series of videos called The And, and they're by a production company called The Skin Deep. And so if you go to YouTube or you Google The Skin Deep, you will find a series of conversations that people are having, that they're friends, family members,
mm,
couples, and they're given these intentional questions that they have to work through. And I use them in some of my workshops. And so that's
mm,
like quite fun and cool. For people who are thinking about um, non-monogamy and jealousy, Kathy Labriola has a book called The Jealousy Workbook, which I think it's quite simple and nice. I don't know that it's the kind of book you're going to use cover to cover, but like there's sections in it that are very helpful because some people will say things like, I just am a jealous person. Well,
mm,
like it doesn't have to be that way. That's like saying, like, I am a person with a broken arm. Okay, but like, what are you going to do about it? Like, is it in a cast? Are you doing
mhm,
physiotherapy? Like,
mhm,
it doesn't
mhm,
have to be this immutable trait, right?
mhm,
Um, Jessica Fern's book called Polysecure, I think, is everywhere. Everyone's reading it, but she does have a particular chart in that book that talks about the different kinds of relationship models. And this graph has two axes. One is high sexual exclusivity to low sexual exclusivity. And then the other axis is high emotional exclusivity to low emotional exclusivity. So you really have to see it to appreciate what I'm talking about. But the visual
mhm.
image is very useful. And that book itself is quite good. Um,
We'll make sure that our interns are mapping that visual over you saying this thing on TikTok. It seems like the perfect thing
that would be
for a Gen Xer to do.
That would be yes, that would be perfect. That would be so perfect. Um, you know, Tristan Taramino's website, like she
Mm,
wrote the book Opening Up, and she still has free resources on her website. And one of them is called Creating an Authentic Relationship, and it's several questions a person can ask themselves about like what they want in a relationship and what constitutes a healthy relationship. Sorry, blah blah blah. That word again. And
mhm,
she also has a helpful opening up checklist. And then the last thing I'll share is the Scarlettine
mm,
handbook that's called Yes, No, Maybe. And it just says like a bunch of sexual things. And it says like,
mhm,
would you want to do this? Yes, no, maybe. And for the maybes, you can talk, if you and a partner do it separately, you can then talk to the partner about what makes it like what conditions would need to be present for you to be more agreeable, or to be more curious about something. It also is a way to like communicate your hard boundaries about something that you
Mm,
wouldn't do, for example.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So those are some resources that I would
mm-hmm.
recommend. I could maybe come up with more, but that's probably good for
I
now.
know. Yeah, I think that's great. I'll also just add, because I gave these suggestions to someone just this week, that these books have tons of worksheets in them. So if you're like me, someone who loves a worksheet, there's a book by Deb Dana called Polyvagal Theory in Therapy, which is good. It does the triggers as well as the glimmers on some of the worksheets. And then there's also a book called Nurturing Resilience, which, let's see if I can get. It's a bunch of Kathy Kane, Stephen Terrell, Peter Levine, who I
Mm.
think is pretty popular in the somatics space. But Nurturing Resilience, so somatic approaches to mental health and well-being. And then I'm actually a pretty big fan of Stacey Haynes' The Politics of Trauma
I
book.
haven't heard of that.
It's pretty good. When I was teaching a senior capstone class, I actually took the teachings from each of the chapters and turned them into worksheets for the students to work through.
Amazing.
But it's basically like mapping your own history, your family or ancestral history, the trauma that you or others around you have experienced, placing yourself into the socio-political climate in particular ways, and just sort of figuring out like how those things impact how you exist in the world in general, how you show up, and how that relates, yeah, to attachment styles, as well as like stress responses, freeze, fawn, etc. So
All the things.
all the things. So
Lovely.
I'll add
Well,
that.
in the chat box, I've also sent you a QR code that'll take you to an Instagram post I made some time ago, which has a series of opening up prompts for opening up conversations. And that's something I also use in my workshops. I was traveling for a while with this workshop called Beyond Eggplants and Peaches. And the idea was just to talk about relationships in real life.
Mm, great. Well, is there anything else? Any closing thoughts? Any final thing you'd like to say? Healthy relationships 101 with Rahim?
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm thinking a lot about relationships at the moment because of the books I'm writing, and they're focused on
Mm,
queer men's mental health and on relationships. And so I would love for folks to follow me, stay in touch, that kind of thing, so that when my books come out, which will just be at the end of
mm-hmm.
2024, um, hopefully my books will be helpful for people, and they could also be like a platform for more conversation. Um, so yeah, thanks for having
Great.
me.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Now you just need to